Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I will be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we focus on issues and problems and solutions that people encounter when they use and manage all the common kinds of fuel that they use both at work and at home. And we like to talk about the things that use that fuel as well, the equipment and big engines that use it on the job, as well as the vehicles and generators and small engines that you might have at home. And that means that the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everyone. So what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, here on the podcast, we've been talking about this big topic of microbial contamination in stored fuel and tanks. Now, anyone who has to manage stored fuel, they've either had to figure out how to deal with microbial contamination in their system, or they're going to have to figure out how to deal with it in the future. It's pretty much inevitable. So we've done a number of episodes on this problem, mainly in our series on microbial myths, where we focused on exploring and debunking the most common microbial myths that persist out there in the marketplace. So in one previous episode, we laid to rest the myth that microbes can't or don't cause contamination or corrosion problems in cold weather. In another episode, we busted the myth that you could solve a microbe problem simply by taking the shortcut of just clearing out the water. You don't have to use a biocide, just take out the water and the microbes will go away. So for today, we're going to continue exploding microbial myths by talking about something that goes with the territory when you've got microbial contamination. That thing is called biomass. So when you've got microbes in your tank, you are going to have biomass contamination as well. And when you find it, it means you need to clean that biomass contamination out. Now, because biomass isn't just a nuisance, it's something that enables microbes to stick around in your system. And very importantly, it's something that actually functions to accelerate corrosion damage in your storage tank. So today on this episode of the podcast, we're going to bust the myth that as long as you kill or get rid of the microbes, you don't need to worry about that biomass. On the contrary, we're going to talk about how important it is to clean out biomass and biofilm once you find it, because the myth is that it doesn't really matter if you do that. Well, we're going to bust that myth by showing you that it does matter. So let's start by acknowledging that when it comes to microbes, what's actually going on in storage tanks is much, much more complex than we could ever imagine. Most of us have no idea the extent of the microbial world around us. I mean, scientists think that there are about 1 trillion species of microbes on planet Earth. And to this point, we've only identified maybe 10 million of those. So take that and then think about what's happening inside of a typical fuel storage tank, maybe a system like yours. There's simply a lot of microbes out there of all different kinds. Now, we keep saying microbes, this term microbes, but what we mean is any number of thousands or tens of thousands of different species of bacteria, molds, and fungi. Now, there are a couple other kinds of microbes that might also appear, but by and large, it's the bacteria and the molds and the fungi that are the primary classes of microbes that cause contamination problems in stored fuel and tanks. And out of all these different kinds of contaminating microbes, there are any number of them that produce this biological matrix that we call biomass. And that's the stuff that we'll be talking about. So how do these microbes make this biomass substance? Well, it starts with the initial attachment of those microbes to surfaces or areas within that tank. So a group of microbes can come into the tank. Maybe they come in through the air. Maybe they come in through water ingress. and they make their way over to either the tank wall or the tank bottom, or they might just migrate to within the fuel to the fuel water interface. All of these areas are places where we can tend to see accumulation of biomass formations. Now, once those microbes are there, provided they have access to the things that they need, they're going to multiply. They're going to form these microcolonies. They're going to interact with other microbes in symbiotic relationships, and they will form these microcolonies that will become colonies that together start producing what scientists call extracellular polymeric substances, or EPS for short. And these substances are the precursors that eventually lead to mature biofilm development. So the microbes are going to metabolize the fuel components they find around them. They're going to produce polysaccharides and lipids and proteins that together form this biological matrix that starts as EPS and later becomes fully mature biofilm. Now, before we go on, we do want to mention that even though there's maybe tens of thousands of different kinds of species of microbes in a storage tank, maybe even within just a tiny little area within that storage tank, the biomass itself tends to be produced only by certain kinds or types of microbes. So fungi and yeasts, those classes are pretty good at degrading fuel quality by consuming specific hydrocarbons out of the fuel, and then they use that to produce biomass accumulation. There are certain types of bacteria, especially the ones known as sulfate-reducing bacteria, or SRBs. And these are not only known for producing acids, but they're also pretty good at producing the biological materials that go into making biomass. And that little bit is kind of important, because just as there are different kinds of microbes within a storage tank environment, the composition and physical properties of the biofilms that they produce can also have a lot of variance depending on the kind of microbial community that produced them. And we say microbial community because symbiosis, that thing we mentioned earlier, symbiosis is a very important concept in microbial environments. See, microbes over the centuries, over the millennia, have become really, really good at coexisting with each other, each performing certain functions that enable the other microbes to grow and thrive alongside them. And we're definitely going to be touching on that later, so just hold that thought. And I would even say that if you could shrink yourself down to a microscopic size and go down into the layer of microbial biomass in your tank, what you would find while you were in there is a microbiological melting pot of thousands or tens of thousands of different species and kinds of microbes. And the reason that they're all there in the same place is because they're all living symbiotically. Like I said, the microbial world is much, much more complex than we have ever realized. So we know microbes produce biomass, but remember, the microbial myth that we're busting here is that it's not really important to actually clean out biofilms once you find them. So for the average person, if they find biomass, they correctly reason that they have a contamination issue. So for the average person, the default solution is likely they need to get rid of the water. Okay, check. Good idea. And they also might think that they need to add biocide to the tank in order to kill the microbes. Another good idea. So removing water, using biocide to kill the microbes. Those are a good start. But the myth is that they don't just have to do anything about the biomass that's in there, because that biomass is just, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's just a nuisance. It's just there. It's not really doing anything. And so it doesn't matter if you get rid of it. I mean, it might end up plugging your filters, and some people worry more about that than other people do. But if you're not that concerned about your filters in that way, then you might think, well, let me just kill the microbes, get the water out. I don't need to go through any of this extra effort of getting rid of the biomass. So that's the myth, right? Now we're going to talk about why it's a myth and why that myth needs to be exploded. And the reason is it's for two big important reasons. Reason number one is that biomass plays an integral part of both causing and accelerating corrosion damage in storage tanks. And then reason number two has to do with the way that microbes use biomass in storage systems and the fact that you might not actually be able to fully eradicate a microbial problem without doing something about that biomass. And if you don't fully eradicate a microbial contamination, then you markedly increase the chances that it's going to come back sooner rather than later. Okay, so let's talk about these two things. Reason number one, biomass plays a key contributing role in corrosion damage in tanks. So biomass itself isn't just some inert biological matrix of polysaccharides and lipids that happens to be laying on top of a tank surface doing nothing. Now, while it may not necessarily be inherently corrosive itself, it does at least two things that are critical to accelerating corrosion damage and making it worse. Those two things are it plays a role in what they call galvanic coupling, and it creates what they call differential aeration cells. Now, both of those things sound kind of technical, and we want to simplify things here. So let's talk about them in simpler terms, right? Okay, number one, a galvanic couple. Okay, when we say that term, galvanic couple is a term that describes a process where two different metals that are in close proximity, close physical proximity to each other, will give away and receive electrons. Now, one of the metals will give away electrons, the other metal will accept them. And the metal that gives away those electrons, that metal will start to corrode. It will start to rust because in giving away its electrons, it's essentially breaking down. Now, sometimes when we describe this kind of electrical phenomenon, and anytime you talk about electrons moving like that, you're talking about an electrical phenomenon. Anytime we use this term, we may use terms anode and cathode, right? In this situation, from what we just described, an anode is the metal that loses its electrons. Sometimes they may call it the sacrificial metal because it donates or gives away those electrons. And it donates those electrons to the metal that's acting as the cathode. The cathode itself doesn't undergo corrosion. No way. It actually gets protected from corrosion because it's not losing electrons, it's gaining them from the anode. And so when this process of electron movement and exchange happens, that's basically what a galvanic couple is. So we said biofilms play a role in this happening. So when you have a biomass layer that's laying on top of a solid surface like a tank wall, for example, that biofilm layer happens to have a bunch of tiny little pockets under it and inside of it where things can gather, where things can get trapped, things can get stuck in there and actually concentrate themselves. So some of those areas might end up having more water in them because the water gets trapped. Some of those pockets might have little pockets of acid in them because the acid gets trapped in that area. Some areas might have a combination of things that results in it having different conditions, kind of a little micro set of conditions than the area around it. And so what ends up happening in a tank environment is that all these differing conditions within that layer of biofilm essentially enhance the movement of electrons and make it easier for certain kinds of metal in the tank to give away their electrons faster, which means you end up with accelerated corrosion. So galvanic coupling happens when two metals exchange electrons. Interestingly, certain kinds of microbes can make the problem worse by essentially mimicking this effort. They can make microbial deposits, microbial byproducts that, while not necessarily acting as anodes or cathodes themselves, strictly speaking, they do help create conditions that either induce or enhance those electrochemical processes, which then, of course, leads to corrosion. And of course, the biomass, all the while this is happening, the biomass is playing an additional essential role of providing a home for the delinquent microbes to keep doing this. So, a couple of specific examples of microbes that play a role in doing this kind of thing. A couple of specific examples are the sulfate reducing bacteria that we mentioned earlier, and also another kind called iron oxidizing bacteria. So, sulfate reducing bacteria will produce byproducts like hydrogen sulfide. And those byproducts will create little localized environments in that biomass that then promote or make easier anodic and cathodic reactions on the metal surfaces. Then you have the iron oxidizing bacteria. These bacteria, because of their name, what do? They directly oxidize iron ions. They take electrons away from those iron ions and they make the iron more reactive, which means then those iron ions are much more likely to then want to participate in what ends up looking like a corrosion reaction. So that's why iron oxidizing bacteria make things worse. So all that together, the first big way that biomass makes corrosion worse through this galvanic coupling phenomenon. Now, one of the hallmarks of corrosion damage that comes from galvanic coupling is that it tends to be localized within specific areas. Often you'll find evidence of it near the contact points where you have two dissimilar metals in a tank. One of those metals, the anode, will exhibit signs of pitting or might even become noticeably thinner over time. While the cathode metal, the protected metal that accepted the electrons, generally remains intact or shows much less damage. So, all that galvanic corrosion, galvanic coupling is the first big way that biomass actually accelerates and makes corrosion worse. The second big way that biomass accelerates corrosion damage, that's through what we would call creation of differential aeration cells. Now, in simple terms, this means that in the areas between the biomass layer and the tank surface that it's laying on, remember, we said that you could find a whole bunch of little pockets all throughout that biomass and all in that area. So in those areas, you're going to get areas that have different oxygen levels. And those varying oxygen levels will cause localized corrosion. Now, to understand why, remember that biofilms are a biological matrix. So as we said, they end up having these gaps and pockets in them where things can get trapped, whether that's water or air or oxygen that gets trapped in there. Now, remember when we said that within the biofilm, there can be thousands of different kinds of microbes that all happen to be living and coexisting together. And while some of the microbes may have an affinity for oxygen, there may be other kinds of microbes living right alongside them that don't like oxygen or might even not survive if they're near it. And so what you can have happen is a pocket of oxygen gets trapped in one of these little pockets in the biofilm on the surface of the metal. And the microbes around it that happen to like that oxygen, they will actually go in and they will consume that oxygen because they like it. And that not only helps those microbes, but it also helps the anaerobic microbes around them that don't like to be around oxygen. So remember, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. And so you'll get pockets of low oxygen concentration in one part of that biofilm. And then higher oxygen concentrations remain outside of those pockets. And that creates an opportunity for corrosion in a couple of ways. For one, It leads to pockets of acid being formed. And acid is, of course, corrosive. The other thing that happens is you can get development of what they call osmotic potentials. So let's explain that. So we have biofilm with microbes in it, and we happen to have lots of pockets that have different oxygen concentrations. And because all of this is actually happening below the fuel line, right down here, there's also diesel fuel that's in and around all of this because this is all under the fuel line. Now, diesel fuel also happens to have oxygen dissolved within it. And so what happens is that because there are different concentrations of oxygen in all those pockets, plus the fuel that's surrounding them, you're going to get this principle of osmosis that comes into play. Now, if you remember from high school science class, right? Osmosis is this principle that if you have different concentrations of things separated from each other, usually by what they call a semi-permeable membrane, different concentrations of things separated from each other, the osmotic principle says that molecules are naturally going to want to move from one side across that membrane to the other side in order to equalize out those differences. So in the case of what we're talking about here, we have different levels of oxygen all going on throughout that biomass and in that fuel. And that means that you're subsequently going to see movement of oxygen into or away from those areas as they try to equalize things out. And anytime you get that kind of molecular movement, you've got the potential for corrosion happening. And that corrosion, none of that could happen if that layer of biomass was not sitting there promoting the potential for that happening. So the end result of all this is you see pitting corrosion. Just like we talked about with galvanic coupling, you get the same kind of corrosion here. You get pitting corrosion, which is a kind of localized corrosion. You'll get pitting corrosion in those areas where those differential aeration cells have developed. And if it happens to take place in the wrong place, it can be dangerous because it can lead to rapid perforation of the tank walls or damage to the tank piping. And it's all because that layer of biomass that we mistakenly thought wasn't really hurting anybody, well, it turns out it very much is hurting the integrity of our storage tank. And therefore, it would probably be a good idea to do something about it. Okay, so we know by now biofilms are not just innocuous, innocent things you don't need to be concerned with. And when you find evidence of biomass in your tank, such as you have clogged filters, that kind of is a hint that you might have biomass forming in there. Not only does it mean you have microbial contamination that needs to be dealt with, you also need to get that biofilm cleaned out of the tank. So how do you clean out biomass? Well, you typically do this with some combination of fuel polishing and filtration. So you're going to remove the water, which means in doing so, you're going to remove some of the biomass rag layer that's accumulated at the interface between the water and the fuel, because you're going to be filtering the fuel at the same time you're doing this. So some of that's going to go away. But you've also got to deal with the biomass that's on the walls and on the other solid surfaces. And that's a little bit of a trickier thing to deal with. Now, different fuel polishers and different fuel filtration experts have different methods for trying to do that. Usually, some combination of high pressure sprays with different kinds of nozzles and stingers. Using a combination of those kinds of things is pretty much standard practice within the industry. And because of the different types of tank design, there's no one method that's accepted across the industry as the single best method that works best for all tanks at all times. But the ultimate goal is, however you choose to do it, the ultimate goal is to dislodge and get out as much of the biomass out of that tank as possible. Now, let's say that you tried to do this but you didn't end up getting all the biomass out. Whether it's because you really didn't think it was all that important, or maybe because you really made a good faith effort to try, but you still, inadvertently left some of that in there. And so let's say then, thinking that you got all that biomass out, you're then going to treat the fuel with biocide because you got to kill the microbial contamination. So that biocide is going to do what it does. It's going to kill everything that it can actually get to. However, there are many kinds of biomass or biofilm layers that really don't allow biocides to get at the microbes that are living inside of them. And so what ends up happening is those microbes end up being protected from the very thing you're trying to use to kill them. So that's good from their standpoint. It's bad from yours, right? So then practically what's going to happen next in this situation is, well, you think you completed the job because you did everything you thought you needed to do. So you wrap everything up and then you proceed about your normal business. And then could be a couple of weeks later, could be a couple of months later, whatever the time frame, you start noticing those same signs of microbial contamination again. And you're puzzled because you just treated for microbes not that long ago. Why are you seeing the problem recurring? Well, it wasn't because the biocide didn't work. Biocide very much did what it was supposed to do, but you still had biomass in that tank, and that biomass was protecting those microbes from that biocide trying to kill them. And so once the smoke cleared, so to speak, those microbes just ended up re-inoculating the tank after you were done, especially if you then later happen to get another fuel drop, right? So that is a big, big reason why it's important to clean out and remove as much of the biofilm from your tank system as possible. Not only because biofilm accelerates corrosion damage, but because biofilms also keep biocides from working as well as they should. Now, there is one thing you can try that will help with this particular problem. Now, in the past, in other episodes of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we've talked about the different kinds of fuel treatment chemistries that can be used out there in the industry. One of the kinds that we've mentioned is what we would call dispersants. And their primary function, when you put dispersants into a stored fuel tank, their primary function is that they're used to attack heavy petroleum dropout, what would be commonly thought of as tank sludge, right? So you add a dispersant, and that dispersant attacks that tank sludge, and it actually functions to redissolve some of the components of that sludge back into the fuel, which then thins the sludge out and makes it easier to remove during a fuel polishing or a fuel filtration process. But one of the other functions that a good dispersant package can do is that they can be formulated to attack biomass formations. That dispersant will go in, once it's in the fuel, it will go in, and when it encounters the biomass, it actually will start trying to break up that biomass once it's in contact with it. And it actually, almost like punching holes in it, almost like somebody punching holes in a sheetrock wall, right? It punches holes in it, it starts to compromise the biomass's structural integrity. So now, not only is that biomass easier to more fully remove, but since it's got holes that's been punched into it, now when you add biocide to the fuel, the microbes can't hide as well behind that protective layer because that layer's not going to protect them as well. And effectively, that means that using a dispersant to break up biomass actually improves the efficacy of the biocide that you're inevitably going to use to try and resolve that microbial problem. So, if you're able to do all of these things, you're less likely to have a repeat of a microbial contamination situation earlier than normal, and you'll protect your tanks better from the kind of corrosion damage that microbial biomass can really accelerate. So keep on keeping an eye on the condition of your stored fuel. watch out for signs of microbial contamination. Better yet, do some periodic microbial testing like ATP bifiltration so that you can better define your expected control limits and better define when you should expect to actually have to spend money on treatment versus just guessing. But from this point on, you're now armed with the knowledge that if you find evidence of what you think is biomass in your fuel system, now you know that it is a serious problem that needs action from you. Not just because it's indicative of a microbial contamination, but because it can play a key role in making expensive corrosion damage worse for you. So, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thanks for joining me today and letting us explode this myth that microbial biomass is some innocuous stuff just floating around in your tank that isn't doing you any harm. We will have links to the things we talked about in our show notes. If you like what you heard and you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to the podcast at your podcast platform of choice, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, whichever ones you, Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, feel free to subscribe. Also, if you haven't done so already, feel free to leave us a rating because that really helps us when we're trying to get the word out and having people that we think would benefit from this being able to find us. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time on the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.